Hi, welcome to this Marxist view of crime review or revision lecture that I've recorded. Just going over the basic ideas of Marxism and for crime and deviance, and this is for the GCSE Eduqas spec, but will probably be useful for the AQA spec as well. So I think first thing to get started with is thinking about how Marxism is different to functionalism in terms of order of teaching. I normally deliver functionalism first. So firstly, Marxists do not trust the official statistics or the police, which makes sense because it's the police that generate official statistics on crime. Marxists do not think they're accurate for a number of reasons, such as unfair policing. Marxists argue that crime isn't caused by social groups or individuals having deviant norms and values. They actually say that crime is caused by inequality in society and things like greed, that we are very much socialized into being greedy or encouraged to fulfill our material needs by either spending money that we have, and if we haven't got it, perhaps turn into crime. So that is an argument from Marxists, which is very different to functionalists. They believe that crime is because of inadequate socialization, or individuals suffering anomie and deviating from the norms and values of society. And finally, Marxists do not trust media reporting on crime. They do not see it as a true picture of what's going on. Unlike functionalists who believe that the media is an accurate reflection of what's happening in society, Marxists do not trust the media. They see it as an agent working for the ruling class. Okay. Oh, and I should have mentioned, that functionalists do trust official statistics. Functionalists believe that the police do a fair and good job to protect society. So, first area I want to talk to you about from Marxist perspective is that they argue that capitalism itself actually causes crime, and it does this through two different ways. The first one is putting pressure on people to buy stuff, putting pressure on people to spend our money, particularly through the bourgeoisie make use of advertising in the media, but not just the media. The whole society is set up to put pressure on us to spend money, whether it's our peer group, our families, running up to things like, how much money is spent around Christmas, for example. There's a lot of pressure to put on people to buy material goods, and we're sort of socialized into believing that we need to spend money in order to be happy. We need to buy gifts for people to make them happy, and if we don't do that, we're bad people in some way. And what that leads to is people who perhaps can't afford to buy these amazing goods, designer goods, these products. They might turn to theft, they might turn to crime in order to afford the products that they're being told they need to consume in order to be happy and good members of society. So, for example, if you want a really flash car, you might turn to criminality in order to be able to afford it. However, the second cause is one we spent a bit more time on in class, is this idea that capitalism fundamentally creates inequality in society. Because capitalism thrives on inequality. It likes the fact that people are rich and some people are poor, because we need poor people to do the lower level jobs anyway. And as a result, capitalism also allows for exploitation in the workplace, where workers are not paid the true value of their labour. They are paid low wages in comparison to the value of their labour. The businesses, if you like, in the bourgeoisie, they have high prices for their products. They put them up in order to make more profit. And ultimately, this leads to many people in society not being able to survive. And as a result, they steal in order to meet basic needs. And one of the case studies we looked at in class was formula. Baby formula, if a baby is not able or is not breastfed, they have to have formula. They can't have cow's milk, for example. So actually buying formula is something that that baby needs to survive. And we looked at the increase in formula theft taking place in supermarkets all over the country. And evidence of that is if you go into any supermarket, formula boxes are now security tagged because they are so often shoplifted and either used for personal consumption or sold on a black market, if you like, of formula exchange, which, is, apart from being devastatingly sad, I think is a really good example to illustrate the fact that inequality is leading to people turning to crime out of desperation in order to help their child to survive. So that's a useful example to use to demonstrate how capitalism can cause crime. Marxists also point out that the media distorts crime. It doesn't paint the true picture of crime, and this very much links to what you've looked at before, the dark figure of crime. Marxists point out that the media is a tool of the ruling class, and more than that, the media is generally owned by the bourgeoisie, and it is in the bourgeoisie's interests to paint crime as a working class phenomena. I've stuck in a picture there of the Murdoch family, a small group of very privileged white, and the dad, Rupert Murdoch, very old men, and they control so many of our media outlets in the UK and other countries, which, and they're one of a very small group in society that control all of the different media outlets, which does mean that quite often the media that we're seeing is distorted through this lens. It reflects what they want us to see. And as a result, they over-report on street crime or crimes that are carried out by powerless groups. And they like reporting and over-reporting on powerless groups, such as the working class, youths and migrants or immigrants, because those groups, they don't have a voice. People don't listen to them. So they are easy groups to target as being criminal. And one of the reasons why they do that, so I've given you some headlines here, about young teens drive violent wave, very much blaming teenagers, often working class teenagers, for violence, or yobs, and about this idea of the blitz on benefit cheats. Those are very much street crimes or crimes of the working class. And when people read those stories, they just think, oh gosh, aren't those groups awful? Isn't the working class awful? And as a result, this justifies much harsher policing of that community, what we call a conflict style of policing, much more physical in terms of how the police interact with working class communities, much more aggressive. And as a result, that does leave that community feeling like the police is not there to help them, but is there very much to police them and to catch them, if you like. As well as harsher policing, we also have much stricter laws being introduced, and the general public thinks great, because they have so many news stories about how awful street crime is. They're like, yes, we need to tackle street crime. So the things like antisocial behaviour orders were introduced, kind of challenging, loud behaviour, disruptive behaviour in the streets. But also things like stop and search, always in the news by giving extra powers, more powers to stop and search, in order to prevent crime. But quite often we see stop and search is very much targeted towards groups that are poorer, in poverty, as well as certain ethnic minority categories as well. So yeah, Marxists do not trust the media, and they say they distort crime for the benefit of the rich. But one evaluation of this point is the fact that the media does sometimes report on crimes of the powerful, and we can look at the BP oil spill and also the VW emissions scandal and some other ones that we're going to look at in this lecture as well. So the argument that the media always works for the ruling class doesn't always hold up to some of the different stories that do get published. Another aspect from the Marxist perspective of crime is unfair law enforcement. This is the idea that the police, and not just the police, I should have mentioned in this slide, the criminal justice system, so that's the courts, the judges, the types of sentences that get handed out, they target working class street crime, okay, and they generally ignore the crimes of the powerful. And as I mentioned previously, generally the police police the middle class communities and working class communities very differently. Okay, and when they're in the middle class communities, they're much more polite to them. They are much more civilized, if you like. Whereas in the working class communities, the police are far more likely to use that conflict style of policing that I mentioned on the previous slide. And one of the problems with that is if the police are more aggressive and more upfront with certain communities, those communities are going to feel labelled. They're going to feel targeted. And quite often that can trigger things like self-fulfilling prophecy that can lead to working class people acting more criminally because that's what they believe society expects of them. Not to mention, if a police officer is a bit rough with a group or an individual from the working class, if the working class person then shoves that police person back or hits them, then they've committed a crime, and they end up showing up in those official crime statistics, reinforcing the view that the working class are criminal. So this unfair law enforcement means that crimes of the powerful, including corporate crime and white-collar crime, are ignored. They are complex, which means that quite often the police don't find out about them, or they struggle to even detect them or catch them. But they're also not very well prosecuted by the criminal justice system. So say it is detected, quite often you don't get guilty verdicts. The example I've given you there, we talked about it in class, was the Starbucks tax scandal, where they were not paying tax. They were denying, or their accounts showed that they weren't making good profit in the UK, so they didn't have to pay tax on their profit. And that turned out not to be true. They were using very sneaky accounting practices in order to avoid paying tax. Nevertheless, and they did pay a tax fine, I think it was 6 million in 1 year, but no one was guilty. There was no criminal record. And actually, in terms of the media coverage, going back to the previous point about the media, it was fairly limited. Not everybody knows about it. And that is, again, part of that distortion of the picture of criminality, where we think working class people are criminal. The chief executives of Starbucks we don't see as criminal as they walk along the streets with their briefcases or what have you. The only final thing to mention about unfair law enforcement is, and this kind of does tie in a bit with the Starbucks point, is when the ruling class, corporate criminals or white-collar criminals, are caught acting criminally, they can hire lawyers. They have the economic capital to hire good lawyers. And that means they avoid convictions, they avoid criminal records. Like I said, at Starbucks, there was no guilty verdict recorded. And the working class just don't have this as an option, okay? They can get a public defender, like a lawyer paid for by the state. They're generally not much busier, they haven't got as much time for the cases, they're not as highly paid. Then this kind of leads to the working class being far, far more likely to be convicted of the street crimes they're picked up for, whereas the ruling class, when they finally are caught, they can get off because they've got amazing lawyers by using their economic capital. So this really does feed into this idea from Marxism that laws are not being enforced properly in the UK and other countries. However, and we talked about this in class, the fact that Starbucks was caught does show that the government and the police don't always ignore the crimes of the powerful, and that Starbucks conviction very much came from the Public Accounts Committee, which sits in government, really grilling them and trying to investigate what had actually gone on with their accounts. So that does show that the government isn't always working to serve the interests of the ruling class. Okay? One of the studies you need to know about for the Marxist perspective is that of William Chambliss. And he did a decade-long study of crime in America, a range of qualitative data collected through interviews, spending time with different aspects of the criminal networks that operated there. And he found that it was ultimately money and power that determined who actually got arrested, so who the police actually arrested. What he found, and this is his terminology, he talks about a criminal elite. And he said this criminal elite, these weren't gangs, this wasn't the mafia, as we might think of when we think of American crime. It was actually businessmen, or women, but mainly businessmen because he was writing in the 70s, legal officials and politicians, all people who you would think of as being respectable members of society. They were the ones who were operating a high level of very, very enriching criminality in the city he was studying. But he found that the jails were consistently filled with the poor and the powerless. And this was because the poor, or the working class, and the powerless, they didn't have the resources to get out of trouble with the law when they committed their very visible street crime, theft, mugging, burglaries, vandalism. They were caught quite easily. They were easily prosecuted because they couldn't afford, if you like, the sorts of defence lawyers that the elite could afford. And what Chambliss found was that police officers were bribed. Bank managers were complicit. They completely ignored some of the tax fraud that was going on because they wanted to have these kind of very, very wealthy clients in their banks. And he found some were even murdered if they were going to go to the police or they were trying to reveal what was actually going on. Okay, so Chambliss is a study that you need to remember to use to argue that, unfair law enforcement definitely happens. The ruling class or the criminal elite get away with it. But one of the things that's worth mentioning about Chambliss' study is it could be seen to be out of date. And nowadays, because it was from the 70s, and nowadays there are there's far more transparency, there's far more investigations and scrutiny of senior business people and politicians. Much more difficult to get away, for example, with bribery and maybe even murder, arguably, because there's a lot more accountability even within the police. Mobile phones recording things, it makes it much harder, perhaps, to do many of these activities. That's one of the evaluations you could maybe use for William Chambliss. The other aspect you need to be aware of from the Marxist perspective is unfair law creation. Now, Marxists argue that laws predominantly benefit the rich. They point to the fact that most law is about protecting private property. And even laws that appear to benefit the poor really benefit the bourgeoisie. So one example we discussed, it's not a very serious set of legislation, is when skateboarding gets banned in town centres. That is very much about protecting private property. It's very much about protecting the interests of businesses. And quite often the sort of people that want to ban skateboarding, they are the middle classes. They are the slightly wealthier, and they're quite often a bit older. Whereas the ones that are doing the skateboarding, they are the powerless group, if you like. They're young people. Sorry, I'm going to cough. Sorry, winter bug. So I think the no skateboarding or banning of skateboarding is a really good illustration about laws protecting private property. In terms of laws that appear to benefit the poor but benefit the bourgeoisie, the NHS is a really good example of this. The NHS, free healthcare for all in the UK. But Marxists would argue that actually the NHS is about creating a healthier workforce, because when people are ill or sick or they get hurt, they can go to the NHS and get fixed and go back to work. The NHS also provides free maternity services, so people are now able to have children safely. And as a result, in the future, the bourgeoisie have a bigger workforce in order to exploit. So that is the Marxist view of certain laws, such as the creation of the NHS, that it's really there to benefit the rich. Marxists also point out that big businesses, or the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, they like laws that make exploitation easier and keep profits high. So, for example, they really like the law that introduced 0-hour contracts. And we looked at the case study on Amazon. If you want to look at that clip again, literally just Google Amazon in Channel 4 News. I'm sure you'll be able to find it. But effectively, the issue was, if you sign up onto a 0-hour contract, your employer decides hour to hour, day to day, how many hours you have. And that really makes it easier to exploit workers, because if a worker thinks, actually, I'm being treated really badly, my working conditions are unsafe, and they report the manager or they report aspects of their workplace, they don't even have to get fired. They just don't get any more hours. They've got no legal right to complain. They just don't get any more hours. And Amazon's not the only company that does this. McDonald's uses 0-hour contracts as well, and other quite big ones. And it just makes it a bit easier to exploit them, okay? Because they don't have to give them the same employment rights as well. And as was discussed in that report, quite often when workers got to, I think, just before 12 weeks of being there, they often got let go. So they didn't qualify for things like holiday pay and sick pay and stuff like that. Laws like 0-hour contracts are a good example of laws created that benefit the ruling class at the expense of the proletariat, because it's easier to exploit them. It is worth mentioning that the laws that the ruling class do not like are things that interfere with profit making. They are not a fan of, for example, of environmental legislation, because quite often that involves modifying their technology, modifying the production of their goods or the transport of their goods to make it more environmentally friendly, which is expensive, and that eats into their profits. And quite often the ruling class are unconcerned with the health of those that live in areas with high pollution, which is predominantly the working class that might live close to really busy roads or really close to factories that pump out pollution. So the ruling class aren't interested in making things environmentally friendly, because it is going to eat into their profits. However, an evaluation of this argument is the fact that the media, like Channel 4 News, did do that report on Amazon, shows that the media is not always working on behalf of the ruling class. Okay, so that's worth being aware. So in the last couple of slides, I just want to talk to you in a bit more detail about white-collar crime and corporate crime. And this is a mixture of, I guess, of unfair law creation and unfair law enforcement, and a bit of, I guess, media manipulation, because we don't generally think of the people that commit these things as criminal. So I'll try and mention those as we go through. So white-collar crime is crime committed by high-status people in the workplace for their own gain. Okay, so it's where they use there's something about their role, their job, they figure out a way to enrich themselves on a personal level. It's very much about individuals, which is different to corporate, which is very much about corporations as a whole. So white-collar crime is about individuals enriching themselves. And good examples are things like bribery, fraud, and the varieties of fraud, but we're going to focus on tax fraud, and embezzlement is when you're enriching yourself from your employer. So you maybe divert funds from, I don't know, your business account into your personal account. Sorry. Or what's it called? Expenses fraud as well. So white-collar crime is complex. It's really difficult to understand. Quite often is to do with accounting. It's time-consuming to investigate. And the police haven't got the best resources to challenge white-collar crime. And often it does get missed. It's often also invisible. People don't notice it. And for example, if it is tax fraud, there is almost like, there's no sense of who is a victim. I don't feel like I'm going to blame some of the celebrities that haven't paid their tax for a lack of increase in my wages. It's too far down the track. You know, if people don't pay their tax, we don't all go, oh, they've cheated me of money. We don't realise. And then finally, white-collar crime, particularly if it's within a company, is often unreported because a company will not want their reputation being negatively affected by the view that they have people embezzling money or investing money or taking money from their clients. So often the people that do carry out white-collar crime, they get away with it. They might get fired, they might get shooed out the door, but they don't get a criminal record, and often can carry on trading or doing whatever they need to do to continue making money legitimately, but also illegally if they need to as well. The case studies we looked at in class included the MP's property scandal, I guess I would describe it. So this is where I think it was about 40 or 50, 160 it says in that article, MPs, they were able to buy London properties, because obviously Parliament is in London and MPs have to travel to London in order to kind of sit in Parliament and vote. So lots of MPs were able to buy properties in London, and the deal was that the taxpayer or tax would be used to pay the interest on those mortgages. So they got some lovely houses in central London, and the interest on their mortgages was paid by taxpayers. The issue was many of them then went on to rent those properties out, and they went and stayed in hotels or rented other flats and claimed that on their expenses. So if they stayed in a hotel because they were renting out the house that they owned, they would claim the cost of that hotel back on their expenses. So they made millions, okay, absolutely millions. Really, really unethical behaviour, and using, if you like, taxpayers' money in a way that I don't think I imagine my tax being used, if you like. There's also a few examples here of members of the bourgeoisie, although you might not always think of them. These are a few different celebrities who've paid for accountants to avoid paying tax. And this is a mixture. They can either use legal loopholes, which is a legal way to avoid tax, and that's evidence of unfair law creation, or, as it turned out in the case of definitely Gary Barlow, they actually end up breaking the law. The accountancy firm that he used broke the law. They are really complex and difficult to prosecute, and they have a low level of law enforcement, this kind of tax fraud, if you like. And in each of the cases, like Gary Barlow is the one I know the most about, I think him and his bandmates, they paid back about 20 million in tax that they owed. But again, nobody got a criminal record, okay? Nobody was convicted. Gary Barlow's apologised for it, but he still managed to keep his OBE that he was awarded. And he still is very successful as a celebrity in the UK. And we don't often look at him and think, oh, there's that man that stole millions and millions of pounds from the country by not paying proper tax. My evaluation of this, and we talked about this in class, some of us, is that because of unfair law creation, what the MPs did, actually didn't break any laws. So technically it's not even a white-collar crime that they've committed. No one can go to jail for it because they haven't broken the law. And instead, that might be a good example to use for unfair law creation, because they are allowed to get away with that because the laws are there to benefit the rich, if you like. But definitely what they did was certainly unethical and certainly immoral. And you can use it as an example of white-collar crime, but if you can remember to mention that in theory they didn't really break the law, that would just push up your marks from an evaluation point of view, if you're focusing on evaluation. And the fact, again, we've said this before, the fact that we know about these celebrity tax dodgers shows us that the media and the police, they are doing things to investigate tax fraud. So the media doesn't always ignore white-collar crime because of the evidence that they've actually reported on these things. So finally, I just wanted to talk about corporate crime. And this is crime committed by organisations and companies rather than individuals. Now, corporate crime is often committed to make more profit. Sorry again. Or out of negligence, or which is neglect, where they've neglected an aspect of maybe health and safety and something happens by accident. However, that negligence is quite often linked to profit, which was what happened maybe with the BP oil spill. Corporate crime, it's worth mentioning, is often far more costly to society and far more dangerous than street crime. But because of the way the media distorts our view about crime, we don't worry about it as much. We assume that those guys and women, in boardrooms are acting ethically. When we see people walk around in suits, we think, oh, they're law-abiding citizens. We don't look at them and think, they're actually fleecing us of money, or they are practicing incredibly unsafe work practices that are putting people's lives at risk. So the case studies we looked at in class, we looked at the VW emissions scandal. So VW is an internationally recognised brand, but when new emissions, limitations were introduced, rather than conforming to the stricter environmental legislation on emissions, which was all about reducing pollution in the atmosphere, reducing the amount of harmful chemicals that were going into the air that we all breathe. Rather than doing that in all their cars, VW actually fitted their cars with software that would trick the tests into saying that the cars were safe. So they made this decision at a corporate level to do something illegal. And they thought they would get away with it, but they didn't, Now this is really, it's hard to measure, if you like, the harm that this has done. And this is another problem with some corporate crimes, if it's about pollution and what have you. How do we measure, how do we know who's been harmed? If somebody becomes ill because they've inhaled so much pollution, do we just blame VW? Do we blame other companies? It's really, really hard to kind of say, right, you have led to this many illnesses and possibly deaths from respiratory problems. But nevertheless, we know it's definitely going to be harmful to health. We also know that it's harmed the environment. And certainly they harmed their customers that bought these expensive cars that they thought were going to pass these tests, and then it turned out that these cars were not going to pass these tests once the software was discovered. So their customers were left out of pocket because they were stuck with cars that were, if you like, illegal in terms of their real emissions. So really, really harmful. And the other example, just to evaluate or to mention about the VW emissions scandal, although nobody went to jail, and that is one of the issues with corporate crime because you can't pin it down on one person, although nobody went to jail, they did, I've mentioned it at the bottom here, their share prices dropped off, massively, and they were fined. So arguably they were punished in a financial way. However, no individual or group have gone to jail. So the last case study, just to mention to you, is the BP oil spillage. Now, the backstory to this is that there was a really old oil rig that BP used in the Gulf of Mexico, which is just off the coast of America. There was a really old oil rig. And they didn't invest in newer, safer well caps, which were at the bottom of the ocean, if you like, that stopped the oil spilling if there was ever like a gas bubble or an oil bubble, I'm not sure. The whole rig itself had so many health and safety concerns. It was overdue for inspections. And they were aware of all these problems, but they didn't do anything about them. And instead, they carried on running that rig, even though workers had reported concerns. And then there was a huge explosion, which killed 11 workers. So this is a corporate crime that actually led to the deaths of some of the workers. And also a huge oil spill that lasted 87 days and something like 134, more than million, I can't remember, billion gallons of oil being dumped into the ocean, killing animals, wiping out fish populations. It meant that people who fished in the area didn't have any source of income for, even today, they still haven't got any source of income. So they've really negatively affected that area. And that was a huge corporate crime, arguably, because someone at a corporate level made that decision not to invest in the new, safer well caps and not to do the health and safety checks that needed to be done. My evaluation of the BP one, I guess, is that the CEO of BP did resign, but nobody did go to jail. Nobody was found guilty. BP has been fined enormously. They are paying a huge amount of compensation to the different people affected in the area. But the company is still trading and they're making an absolute fortune off oil at the moment. So again, they haven't been that badly harmed. Final thing just to look at in this lecture is a 15-mark essay that you could get in the exam. This is an Eduqas exam paper question. And I've given you Marxist theories of crime are more useful than functionalist theories, I should say, instead of that, discuss this view. As with all 15-mark essays, you need 3 decent points with some level of debate and a good conclusion. So I've given you some sentence starters there just to prompt you as to how you would answer this question. Please use your notes on this lecture to think about it, how you would answer it. And I just want to draw your attention to the conclusion. For those of you pushing for the higher grades, your conclusion is so important, but you need to say something more than, to conclude, the argument I think is strongest is the view that corporate crime is ignored by the press. But you need to say why you think those sorts of ideas, or you might say, why do you think Marxism is way more useful than functionalism? You've got to explain your reasoning behind it. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope this is of use.